The sun blazed mercilessly over the Nile Valley in the 14th century BCE, casting its golden light upon an empire that stretched from the cataracts of Nubia in the south to the Euphrates River in the north. This was Egypt at the height of its power during the 18th dynasty, a civilization so wealthy and magnificent that foreign kings sent tribute and begged for Egyptian gold. The pharaoh was not merely a king, but a living god, the earthly embodiment of Horus, maintaining the cosmic order known as Ma'at that kept chaos at bay. For over a millennium, this divine kingship had governed the land of the pharaohs, creating a stability so profound that the very concept of change seemed foreign to Egyptian minds. Amenhotep III, whose name meant Amun is satisfied, ruled this golden age with unprecedented splendor from approximately 1391 to 1353 BCE. His reign represented the pinnacle of Egyptian prosperity, diplomacy, and artistic achievement. The pharaoh's palace at Malkata, on the west bank of Thebes, was a wonder of the ancient world, its walls decorated with vibrant paintings depicting the king as a divine hunter of lions and bulls. Diplomatic correspondence found at Amarna reveals that foreign rulers addressed Amenhotep III as the Great King, acknowledging Egypt's supremacy in the ancient Near East. The Mitanni, Babylonians, and Assyrians all sought Egyptian favor, sending their daughters as wives to cement alliances and requesting Egyptian gold, which they claimed was as common as dust in the land of the pharaohs. The religious landscape of this golden age was dominated by the ancient pantheon that had governed Egyptian spiritual life for millennia. Amun-Ra, the king of the gods, reigned supreme from his magnificent temple complex at Karnak, where his priests wielded enormous political and economic power. The god's daily rituals required vast resources, and his temples owned approximately 1/3 of all cultivated land in Egypt. Ra, the sun god, sailed across the sky each day in his solar bark, battling the serpent Apophis in the underworld each night to ensure the sun's rebirth at dawn. Osiris ruled the afterlife, promising eternal life to those who lived according to Ma'at and were properly mummified and buried. Isis, the divine mother, protected the living and the dead with her powerful magic, while Ptah of Memphis was revered as the creator god who spoke the world into existence. The priesthood formed a powerful class that rivaled the pharaoh's authority in many respects. The high priest of Amun at Thebes controlled vast wealth and commanded the loyalty of thousands of lesser priests, scribes, and temple workers. These religious officials maintained the daily rituals that kept the gods satisfied and the cosmic order intact. They performed the elaborate ceremonies that transformed ordinary bread and beer into divine sustenance, conducted the festivals that brought the gods among the people, and preserved the sacred knowledge that had been passed down since the time of the pyramids. The temples served not only as religious centers, but as economic powerhouses, controlling trade routes, manufacturing goods, and lending money throughout the empire. Egyptian society during this period was rigidly hierarchical, yet remarkably stable. At the apex stood the divine pharaoh, followed by the royal family, high priests, and government officials. Below them were the scribes, whose literacy made them indispensable to the administration of the empire. Skilled craftsmen, including the master builders and artists who created the magnificent tombs and temples, occupied a respected middle tier. The vast majority of Egyptians were farmers who worked the fertile fields along the Nile, their lives governed by the annual flood cycle that brought life to the desert. Even slaves, often prisoners of war from Egypt's military campaigns, could rise in status and sometimes achieve freedom through loyal service. The artistic achievements of Amenhotep III's reign reflected the confidence and prosperity of the age. Sculptors created masterpieces of idealized royal portraiture, showing the king as eternally youthful and divinely perfect. The famous quartzite head of Amenhotep III, now in the British Museum, captures this artistic ideal with its serene expression and perfectly balanced features. Painters developed sophisticated techniques for depicting the natural world, creating tomb paintings that showed gardens filled with exotic plants, pools teeming with fish and waterfowl, and hunting scenes in the marshes of the delta. Architecture reached new heights of grandeur, with temples that dwarfed earlier constructions and palaces that showcased the wealth flowing into Egypt from its empire and trade networks. The military machine that protected this prosperity was the most advanced in the ancient world. Egyptian armies wielded bronze weapons, horse-drawn chariots, and composite bows that could pierce armor at considerable distances. Professional soldiers, many recruited from Nubia and other conquered territories, formed the backbone of forces that maintained Egyptian dominance from the Sudan to Syria. The pharaoh's navy controlled the eastern Mediterranean, protecting trade routes and projecting Egyptian power to distant shores. Fortresses along the Nile's cataracts and in the Sinai Peninsula guarded the empire's borders, while diplomatic marriages and tribute arrangements maintained peace with potential rivals. Yet, beneath this glittering surface, subtle changes were beginning to stir. Amenhotep III showed an unusual interest in solar theology, building temples to Ra-Horakhti and emphasizing the sun god's role in royal ideology. His son, the future Amenhotep IV, grew up in this environment where traditional religious boundaries were already being questioned. The enormous wealth flowing into Egypt had made the priesthood of Amun incredibly powerful, potentially threatening royal authority. Foreign influences, brought by diplomatic marriages and international trade, introduced new ideas and customs to the traditionally conservative Egyptian court. The stage was being set for a revolution that would shake the very foundations of Egyptian civilization, though none could have predicted the radical transformation that lay ahead. The golden age of Amenhotep III would soon give way to the most turbulent period in Egyptian history as his son prepared to challenge 3,000 years of tradition and religious orthodoxy. When Amenhotep IV ascended to the throne around 1353 BCE, few could have anticipated that this young pharaoh would orchestrate the most radical transformation in Egyptian history. Within the first few years of his reign, the new king began displaying an obsession with the sun disk known as the Aten that would ultimately consume his entire worldview and reshape Egyptian civilization. Unlike his predecessors, who had gradually evolved religious practices, Amenhotep IV launched a systematic assault on the very foundations of Egyptian spirituality, politics, and culture that had remained unchanged for over 3 millennia. The transformation began subtly during the early years of his reign in Thebes, the traditional capital where the god Amun-Ra held supreme power. Amenhotep IV commissioned temples to the Aten that featured revolutionary architectural designs, abandoning the dark, mysterious sanctuaries of traditional Egyptian temples for open-air courtyards flooded with sunlight. These structures, built at Karnak itself in the shadow of Amun's great temple, represented a direct challenge to the established priesthood. The young pharaoh's artists began depicting him in a startlingly naturalistic style, showing his elongated face, prominent chin, and feminine hips in stark contrast to the idealized royal portraiture that had dominated Egyptian art for centuries. By his 5th regnal year, Amenhotep IV had made his revolutionary intentions unmistakably clear. He changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten, formally announcing his allegiance to the sun disk above all other gods. More dramatically, he ordered the construction of an entirely new capital city in Middle Egypt, a virgin site he called Akhetaten, Horizon of the Aten, known today as Amarna. This unprecedented decision to abandon Thebes, Memphis, and all the traditional centers of Egyptian power represented a complete break with the past. The king declared that the Aten himself had chosen this location, marking out the city's boundaries with a series of carved stelae that proclaimed the site's eternal sanctity. The new city of Akhetaten rose from the desert with astonishing speed, its construction driven by the pharaoh's religious fervor and unlimited resources. Unlike traditional Egyptian cities that grew organically over centuries, Akhetaten was planned as a perfect expression of Atenist ideology. The Great Temple of the Aten dominated the city center, its vast open courtyards designed to receive the sun's rays throughout the day. Hundreds of offering tables lined these courtyards, where priests presented food and flowers directly to the sun disk without the elaborate rituals and hidden sanctuaries that characterize traditional Egyptian worship. The royal palace stretched for over a kilometer along the Nile, connected to the temple by a magnificent bridge that allowed the royal family to move between their residence and the sacred precinct while remaining visible to their subjects. Akhenaten's religious revolution extended far beyond architectural innovation to encompass a complete reimagining of Egyptian theology. The pharaoh proclaimed that the Aten was not merely the supreme god, but the only god, making him history's first known monotheist. All other deities were declared false, their temples closed, their priests dismissed, and their names systematically chiseled from monuments throughout Egypt. The Aten was depicted as a sun disk whose rays ended in hands that offered the Ankh, symbol of life, exclusively to the royal family. This imagery reinforced Akhenaten's claim that he and his queen, Nefertiti, were the sole intermediaries between the Aten and humanity, effectively making themselves the focus of all religious devotion. The famous Great Hymn to the Aten, possibly composed by Akhenaten himself, reveals the sophisticated theology underlying this revolution. The hymn describes the Aten as the creator of all life, the source of the Nile's flood, and the provider of sustenance to all creatures. It presents a vision of universal divine love that transcends national boundaries, describing how the Aten cares equally for Egyptians and foreigners, a radical departure from traditional Egyptian religious nationalism. The hymn's emphasis on the Aten's role as creator and sustainer of life shows clear parallels to later monotheistic traditions, leading some scholars to see Akhenaten as a precursor to biblical monotheism. The artistic revolution that accompanied these religious changes was equally dramatic. Akhenaten encouraged his artists to abandon the rigid conventions that had governed Egyptian art for millennia, instead embracing a naturalistic style that showed the royal family in intimate human moments. Relief carvings depicted the king and queen kissing their daughters, relaxing in their palace gardens, and worshipping the Aten together as a family unit. The famous bust of Nefertiti, discovered in the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose, exemplifies this new artistic freedom with its lifelike portrayal of individual beauty rather than idealized divine perfection. Even the king himself was shown with his physical peculiarities emphasized rather than hidden, creating some of the most psychologically penetrating royal portraits in ancient art. The social implications of Akhenaten's revolution were profound and far-reaching. The traditional priesthood, which had wielded enormous power and controlled vast wealth, found itself suddenly unemployed and dispossessed. Temples that had operated for centuries were shuttered, their revenues redirected to support the new Atenist cult. The scribal schools attached to these temples, which had preserved and transmitted Egyptian learning for generations, were disrupted, threatening the continuity of traditional knowledge. Provincial governors and local officials, many of whom owed their positions to connections with the old priesthood, faced an uncertain future in the new order. The economic consequences of this upheaval rippled throughout Egyptian society. The construction of Akhetaten required enormous resources, draining the royal treasury and demanding corvée labor from across the empire. Traditional trade relationships, often mediated through temple networks, were disrupted as the old religious infrastructure collapsed. Foreign allies and vassals, accustomed to dealing with established Egyptian institutions, struggled to understand the new political reality. Diplomatic correspondence from this period reveals growing confusion and concern among Egypt's international partners as traditional diplomatic protocols were abandoned in favor of Atenist ideology, despite the revolutionary fervor of its early years. Akhenaten's experiment began showing signs of strain as his reign progressed. The pharaoh's increasing isolation in his purpose-built capital left him disconnected from the practical realities of governing a vast empire. Military campaigns that had maintained Egyptian prestige in the Near East were neglected as the king focused obsessively on religious matters. The Amarna letters, diplomatic archives discovered at the site, reveal desperate pleas from Egyptian vassals in Syria and Palestine begging for military support against encroaching enemies, requests that often went unanswered as Akhenaten pursued his spiritual vision. In the swirling chaos of Akhenaten's revolutionary reign, sometime around 1341 BCE, a prince was born who would become one of history's most famous pharaohs, despite ruling for less than a decade. The circumstances surrounding Tutankhamun's birth remain shrouded in mystery, reflecting the deliberate erasure of the Amarna period from official Egyptian records and the complex family dynamics of Akhenaten's court. Early theories suggested he might have been the son of Amenhotep III, making him Akhenaten's brother rather than son. But this hypothesis has been largely abandoned based on chronological evidence. The most compelling evidence points to Akhenaten as his father, supported by DNA analysis conducted on royal mummies in 2010. These genetic studies revealed that Tutankhamun was indeed the son of the mummy found in tomb KV55, now widely accepted as Akhenaten, though the scientific methodology and conclusions remain subjects of scholarly debate. The identity of Tutankhamun's mother presents an even more complex puzzle. DNA evidence indicates that she was a sister to Akhenaten, reflecting the royal family's practice of sibling marriage to maintain bloodline purity. However, her specific identity remains uncertain. Some scholars propose she was Akhenaten's lesser-known wife, while others suggest she might have been one of Amenhotep III's daughters, who married her half-brother, Akhenaten. The famous younger lady mummy found in tomb KV35 has been tentatively identified as Tutankhamun's mother based on genetic analysis, but her historical identity remains elusive. This name reveals that he was intended from birth to be a living embodiment of Akhenaten's monotheistic vision, raised to continue the worship of the Aten and maintain the radical transformation of Egyptian religion. The young prince would have spent his earliest years in the purpose-built city of Akhetaten, surrounded by the revolutionary art, architecture, and ideology that defined his father's reign. The palace complex where he lived was a marvel of ancient engineering, with painted floors depicting marsh scenes, walls covered in naturalistic reliefs, and gardens filled with exotic plants from across the Egyptian empire. Life in Akhetaten during Tutankhamun's childhood would have been unlike anywhere else in the ancient world. The city buzzed with creative energy as artists, architects, and craftsmen worked to realize Akhenaten's vision of a perfect Atenist society. The young prince would have witnessed daily the open-air worship ceremonies in the Great Temple, where his father and stepmother, Nefertiti, presented offerings directly to the sun disk. Unlike traditional Egyptian princes who were educated in the mysteries of the ancient gods, Tutankhamun was raised exclusively in Atenist theology, learning to see the sun disk as the sole source of all life, and his father as the god's chosen representative on earth. The prince's education would have followed royal traditions adapted to Atenist ideology. He learned to read and write hieroglyphs, studying texts that praised the Aten rather than the traditional pantheon. Military training prepared him for his future role as pharaoh and commander of Egypt's armies, though the practical aspects of this education may have been neglected as Akhenaten focused increasingly on religious rather than military matters. The young prince learned to drive a chariot, shoot a bow, and wield the traditional weapons of Egyptian warfare, skills that would be reflected in the military equipment found in his tomb. He also received instruction in the arts of kingship, learning the complex rituals and ceremonies that would define his future reign, though these too were modified to reflect Atenist rather than traditional religious practices. The royal workshops of Akhetaten produced magnificent objects for the young prince, many of which would eventually accompany him to his tomb. Skilled craftsmen created toys, games, and miniature weapons appropriate for a royal child, including the famous ivory and ebony Senate boards that would provide entertainment in the afterlife. The naturalistic artistic style encouraged by Akhenaten influenced even these childhood objects, which displayed a liveliness and humanity absent from the more formal royal artifacts of earlier periods. Golden jewelry, precious amulets, and elaborate clothing marked the prince's exalted status while reflecting the wealth that still flowed into Egypt, despite the religious upheaval. As Tutankhamun grew from infant to child, the political situation in Egypt became increasingly unstable. Akhenaten's religious revolution had created powerful enemies among the displaced priesthood, while his neglect of military affairs allowed Egypt's empire to crumble. The Amarna letters reveal desperate pleas from Egyptian vassals in Syria and Palestine, begging for military support that rarely came, as the pharaoh remained focused on his religious vision. This deteriorating situation would have created an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty in the royal palace, even as the young prince continued his sheltered existence within the walls of Akhetaten. The prince's relationship with the various members of Akhenaten's complex family remains largely mysterious. Nefertiti, his stepmother, wielded enormous influence during the early years of his life, appearing alongside Akhenaten in countless reliefs and sculptures as co-ruler of Egypt. The famous bust of Nefertiti, discovered in the sculptor Thutmose's workshop at Amarna, dates to this period and reflects the queen's prominent role in the Atenist court. Tutankhamun would also have known his half-sisters, the daughters of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, who appear frequently in Amarna art, playing with their parents in scenes of domestic intimacy unprecedented in Egyptian royal iconography. The prince's early years coincided with the height of Amarna's artistic achievement, when the revolutionary naturalistic style reached its full flowering. He would have grown up surrounded by masterpieces of ancient art, from the painted pavements of the palace to the exquisite relief carvings in the royal tomb. This artistic environment shaped his aesthetic sensibilities and would influence the magnificent objects created for his own burial, which combined traditional Egyptian motifs with the naturalistic innovations of the Amarna period. The famous golden mask that covered his mummy represents a synthesis of these artistic traditions, showing how the Amarna revolution continued to influence Egyptian art even after the restoration of the traditional religion. By the time Tutankhamun reached his 7th or 8th year, cracks were beginning to appear in his father's revolutionary experiment. Nefertiti disappeared from the historical record around this time, possibly dying or falling from favor, leaving the young prince in an increasingly precarious position. The economic strain of maintaining Akhetaten while neglecting the traditional sources of Egyptian wealth was becoming unsustainable, and pressure was mounting from the displaced priesthood and military leaders for a return to orthodox religion and effective governance. The death of Akhenaten around 1336 BCE plunged Egypt into a succession crisis that would ultimately place a 9-year-old boy on the throne of the world's most powerful empire. The circumstances surrounding this transition remain among the most debated topics in Egyptology, complicated by the deliberate destruction of records from the Amarna period and the brief, shadowy reigns that preceded Tutankhamun's accession. What emerges from the fragmentary evidence is a picture of political chaos, religious upheaval, and desperate maneuvering among Egypt's elite as they struggled to maintain stability in the face of unprecedented challenges. The immediate aftermath of Akhenaten's death saw the emergence of a mysterious figure known as Shmenkara, whose relationship to the royal family and exact role in the succession remains hotly contested. Some scholars identify Shmenkara as a male relative of Akhenaten, possibly a brother or son, who served as co-regent during the heretic pharaoh's final years. Others propose that Shmenkara was actually Nefertiti, ruling under a masculine throne name, a theory supported by the Queen's prominent role in Atenist ideology and her sudden disappearance from the historical record. The evidence for Shmenkara's reign is tantalizingly sparse, consisting mainly of a few inscriptions and objects that suggest a ruler who attempted to maintain Atenist religious practices while beginning the process of reconciliation with traditional Egyptian religion. Archaeological evidence from Amarna suggests that the city began experiencing serious problems during this transitional period. The economic strain of maintaining the artificial capital while neglecting the traditional administrative centers had become unsustainable, and the displaced priesthood and military leaders were growing increasingly bold in their opposition to Atenist rule. Into this chaos stepped the young Prince Tutankhamun, whose very survival during this turbulent period suggests he enjoyed powerful protection. The boy's youth made him an ideal candidate for those seeking to restore traditional Egyptian religion and governance while maintaining the legitimacy of royal bloodline. His tender age meant he could be easily controlled by regents and advisors, allowing the real power brokers to implement their agenda while using the child pharaoh as a figurehead. The decision to place Tutankhamun on the throne represented a carefully calculated compromise between competing factions within the Egyptian elite. The coronation of the 9-year-old pharaoh would have followed ancient protocols adapted to the extraordinary circumstances of his accession. Traditional Egyptian coronation ceremonies involved complex rituals performed in the great temples of Memphis and Thebes, but these had been disrupted by Akhenaten's religious revolution. The famous golden throne, found in his tomb, which depicts the young king and queen under the rays of the Aten, may have been created for this coronation ceremony, symbolizing the transitional nature of his early reign. The new pharaoh's marriage to Ankhesenamun, daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, served multiple political purposes beyond the traditional royal practice of sibling marriage. Ankhesenamun, who was probably several years older than her husband, had already experienced the upheavals of the Amarna period. The intimate scenes depicted on objects found in their tomb suggest a genuine affection between the young couple, though their relationship was undoubtedly shaped by the political necessities of their situation. The challenge facing the child, Pharaoh, and his advisors was immense. Egypt's empire was crumbling as vassal states in Syria and Palestine either declared independence or fell to rival powers. The Hittite Empire was expanding southward, threatening Egyptian interests in the Levant, while Nubian territories showed signs of restlessness. This move was both practical and symbolic, representing a rejection of Akhenaten's radical experiment and a return to the time-tested institutions that had governed Egypt for millennia. The evacuation of Amarna was conducted with remarkable thoroughness, with valuable objects transported to other royal residences and the city's administrative functions transferred to Memphis and Thebes. The famous restoration, Stelash, found at Karnak, describes how the young pharaoh found Egypt in a state of chaos, with temples abandoned and the gods angry, and how his reign brought about a return to divine favor and prosperity. While this inscription was clearly propaganda designed to legitimize the new regime, it also reflects the genuine challenges facing Egypt during this transitional period. The process of religious restoration required delicate handling, as many Egyptians had lived through Akhenaten's revolution, and some may have genuinely embraced Atenist beliefs. Rather than conducting a violent purge, Tutankhamun's advisors pursued a policy of gradual transition that allowed former Atenist officials to retain their positions if they demonstrated loyalty to the restored traditional religion. This pragmatic approach helped maintain administrative continuity while avoiding the kind of widespread persecution that might have destabilized the kingdom further. The young pharaoh's court became a center of artistic and cultural renaissance as traditional Egyptian civilization reasserted itself. Craftsmen who had fled Amarna returned to royal service, bringing with them the technical innovations and artistic insights gained during the Atenist period. The result was a unique synthesis of traditional Egyptian forms with the naturalistic elements introduced during Akhenaten's reign, creating some of the most beautiful objects in Egyptian art history. The treasures found in Tutankhamun's tomb represent the pinnacle of this artistic revival, combining ancient religious symbolism with unprecedented technical mastery. Despite his youth, Tutankhamun was expected to fulfill all the traditional roles of pharaoh, from leading religious ceremonies to commanding military campaigns. Contemporary reliefs show the young king participating in temple rituals, offering to the gods, and receiving tribute from foreign delegations. While much of this was undoubtedly ceremonial, with real power exercised by his advisors, the boy pharaoh's public appearances served the crucial function of maintaining the divine mystique of kingship that was essential to Egyptian political stability. While the 9-year-old Tutankhamun bore the divine titles and regalia of pharaoh, the actual governance of Egypt rested in the hands of powerful courtiers who had survived the chaos of Akhenaten's revolution and positioned themselves to control the restoration. Chief among these figures was an enigmatic nobleman whose exact origins remain debated, but whose influence over the young king was undeniable. Inscriptions identify with the title God's Father, a designation that may indicate he was related to the royal family through marriage, possibly as the father of Queen Nefertiti or another of Akhenaten's wives. This connection would have given him intimate knowledge of royal politics and positioned him perfectly to guide the transition from Atenist revolution back to traditional Egyptian governance. I's background suggests a man of exceptional political skill who had managed to maintain his position throughout the upheavals of the Amarna period. Unlike many courtiers who were either displaced by Akhenaten's revolution or compromised by their association with it, I appears to have navigated the changing political landscape with remarkable dexterity. His tomb at Amarna, decorated with scenes showing him receiving gold collars from Akhenaten and Nefertiti, demonstrates his high standing during the revolutionary period, yet he successfully transitioned to become the power behind Tutankhamun's restoration. This political survival suggests a man of considerable cunning and adaptability, qualities that would prove essential in managing Egypt's return to stability. The second major figure wielding power during Tutankhamun's minority was Horemheb, a military commander whose career had begun during the reign of Amenhotep III and who had risen to prominence during the later years of Akhenaten's rule. Unlike whose power derived from court connections and administrative expertise, Horemheb commanded the loyalty of Egypt's professional military forces, making him indispensable to any regime seeking to restore Egyptian prestige abroad and maintain order at home. His tomb at Saqqara, built during Tutankhamun's reign, depicts him receiving tribute from foreign delegations and leading military campaigns, suggesting he served as the young pharaoh's deputy in military and foreign affairs. The relationship between and Horemheb during Tutankhamun's reign appears to have been one of careful cooperation rather than open rivalry though both men were undoubtedly positioning themselves for the succession should the young pharaoh die without an heir. Their different power bases complemented each other effectively, with Ai managing domestic policy and religious restoration, while Horemheb focused on military affairs and foreign relations. This division of responsibilities allowed the regency to function smoothly while maintaining the fiction that the child pharaoh was actually ruling Egypt. Contemporary inscriptions carefully preserve this illusion, showing Tutankhamun making decisions and issuing decrees that were almost certainly formulated by his advisors. The challenge facing these regents was enormous, requiring them to simultaneously restore traditional Egyptian religion, rebuild the empire's military prestige, and manage the economic disruption caused by Akhenaten's policies. The abandonment of Amarna alone represented a massive logistical undertaking, involving the transfer of government offices, royal workshops, and thousands of officials back to the traditional capitals. The regents had to coordinate this move while maintaining the continuity of government services and avoiding the kind of administrative chaos that might have invited foreign invasion or domestic rebellion. Religious restoration required particularly delicate handling, as the regents needed to satisfy the displaced traditional priesthood without alienating those Egyptians who had embraced Atenist beliefs. Ai, with his court connections and administrative experience, took the lead in this process, overseeing the reopening of traditional temples and the restoration of their endowments. The famous Restoration Stela, erected in Tutankhamun's name at Karnak Temple, describes how the young pharaoh found Egypt's temples in ruins and the gods angry, then restored proper worship and divine favor. While this inscription was clearly propaganda, it also reflects the genuine challenges facing the restoration government and their systematic approach to rebuilding traditional religious institutions. The economic aspects of restoration were equally complex, requiring the regents to redirect resources from Atenist projects to traditional religious and military priorities. The wealth that had been concentrated in Amarna needed to be redistributed to restore the economic networks that had sustained Egyptian civilization for centuries. Temple workshops that had been closed during Akhenaten's reign were reopened and restaffed. Trade relationships disrupted by the religious revolution were re-established, and the complex system of taxation and tribute that funded the Egyptian state was rebuilt on traditional foundations. Horemheb's military expertise proved crucial in addressing Egypt's deteriorating international position. The Amarna letters reveal that Egyptian prestige in the Near East had suffered severely during Akhenaten's reign, with vassal states either declaring independence or falling to rival powers. Horemheb appears to have conducted limited military campaigns during Tutankhamun's reign, aimed more at demonstrating Egyptian strength than at major territorial conquest. These expeditions served the dual purpose of maintaining military readiness and providing the young pharaoh with opportunities to fulfill his traditional role as Egypt's war leader, even if his actual participation was largely ceremonial. The regents also had to manage the complex web of court politics that surrounded the young pharaoh and his queen. Ankhesenamun, as daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, represented both a link to royal legitimacy and a potential source of instability if she chose to champion Atenist restoration. The regents appear to have handled this challenge by incorporating her into the restoration narrative, presenting the royal couple as joint agents of religious and political renewal. Scenes in Tutankhamun's tomb show the young queen participating in traditional religious ceremonies, suggesting her successful integration into the restored Orthodox system. The education of the young pharaoh represented another crucial responsibility for his regents, who needed to prepare him for eventual independent rule while ensuring his loyalty to their restoration agenda. Tutankhamun's training would have included traditional royal subjects such as military leadership, religious ritual, and statecraft, but adapted to emphasize Orthodox Egyptian values rather than Atenist ideology, The regents had to carefully balance the need to educate their charge with the desire to maintain their own control, creating a delicate dynamic that would persist throughout his reign. Palace life during the regency was carefully orchestrated to maintain the dignity and mystique of pharaonic rule, while allowing the real decision-makers to operate behind the scenes. Court ceremonies followed ancient protocols that emphasized the divine nature of kingship, with the young pharaoh appearing in public wearing the traditional crowns and regalia of his office. These appearances served to reassure the Egyptian people that legitimate royal authority had been restored and that the chaos of the Amarna period was definitively ended. The regent's success in managing this complex transition is evidenced by the relative stability that characterized most of Tutankhamun's reign. Unlike the upheavals that had marked Akhenaten's rule and would follow Tutankhamun's death, the decade of the boy king's reign saw a gradual but steady restoration of traditional Egyptian institutions and values. This achievement required exceptional political skill and coordination between men whose personal ambitions might otherwise have led to conflict, demonstrating the pragmatic cooperation that characterized Egyptian elite politics at its best. The systematic restoration of traditional Egyptian religion during Tutankhamun's reign represented one of the most comprehensive religious counter-revolutions in ancient history, requiring the careful dismantling of Akhenaten's monotheistic experiment while rebuilding institutions that had sustained Egyptian civilization for over 2 millennia. This process began almost immediately after the young pharaoh's accession, driven by the urgent need to restore divine favor and social stability to a kingdom that had been traumatized by religious upheaval. The restoration was not merely a return to the past, but a deliberate reconstruction of Egyptian orthodoxy that incorporated lessons learned from the Atenist period while rejecting its radical innovations. The reopening of traditional temples marked the most visible aspect of this religious restoration, requiring massive investments of royal resources and careful coordination with the displaced priesthood. Temples throughout Egypt had been closed during Akhenaten's reign, their priests dismissed, their rituals abandoned, and their endowments confiscated to fund Atenist projects. The young pharaoh's government faced the enormous task of restoring these institutions while managing the expectations of priests who had lost their livelihoods and communities that had been deprived of their traditional religious services. The famous restoration stela erected at Karnak Temple provides a royal account of this process, describing how Tutankhamun found Egypt's temples in ruins with their gods having abandoned the land, then systematically restored proper worship and divine protection. The restoration of Amun-Ra to his position as king of the gods required particular attention, given that Akhenaten had specifically targeted this deity for elimination. The great temple complex at Karnak, which had been partially dismantled during the Atenist period, underwent extensive renovation and expansion under Tutankhamun's patronage. New statues of Amun were commissioned to replace those destroyed by Akhenaten's agents, while the temple's vast economic infrastructure was rebuilt to support the elaborate daily rituals that maintained the god's presence among his people. The restoration of Amun's cult was not merely religious, but profoundly political, as the god's priesthood had traditionally served as a check on royal power, and their support was essential for the legitimacy of the restored monarchy. The process of religious restoration extended far beyond the major temples to encompass the countless local shrines and household gods that had sustained Egyptian popular religion for centuries. Village temples dedicated to regional deities were reopened and their festivals restored, providing communities with the religious celebrations that had marked the rhythm of Egyptian life since time immemorial. The Restoration government recognized that popular support for the counter-revolution depended not only on satisfying the elite priesthood, but also on meeting the spiritual needs of ordinary Egyptians who had been deprived of their traditional religious practices during the Atenist experiment. The economic aspects of religious restoration proved as challenging as the spiritual dimensions, requiring the redirection of vast resources from Atenist projects to traditional religious institutions. Temples had traditionally controlled approximately 1/3 of Egypt's cultivated land, generating the wealth needed to support their elaborate rituals and extensive personnel. Akhenaten's confiscation of these endowments had disrupted not only religious practices, but also the economic networks that sustained Egyptian agriculture and trade. Tutankhamun's government had to carefully redistribute these resources while avoiding the kind of economic chaos that might have undermined the restoration itself. The restoration of traditional Egyptian art and iconography accompanied the religious counter-revolution as craftsmen abandoned the naturalistic Amarna style in favor of the idealized forms that had characterized Egyptian art for millennia. Royal workshops were re-established in Memphis and Thebes, staffed with artists who had either fled Amarna or been trained in traditional techniques. These craftsmen faced the challenge of creating objects that honored the restored gods, while incorporating the technical innovations developed during the Atenist period. The magnificent artifacts found in Tutankhamun's tomb represent the pinnacle of this artistic synthesis, combining traditional Egyptian religious symbolism with unprecedented technical mastery. The young pharaoh's personal transformation from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun symbolized the broader religious restoration taking place throughout Egypt. The change from living image of the Aten to living image of Amun represented a complete rejection of his father's religious revolution and a public commitment to Orthodox Egyptian beliefs. This name change was accompanied by modifications to royal iconography, with the Aten disk being replaced by traditional symbols of divine kingship, such as the Uraeus serpent and the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Contemporary reliefs show the young king participating in traditional religious ceremonies, offering to the restored gods, and receiving their blessings in return. The restoration of traditional funerary practices represented another crucial aspect of the religious counter-revolution, as Akhenaten had disrupted the elaborate burial customs that promised eternal life to faithful Egyptians. The Atenist period had seen a simplification of tomb decoration and a reduction in the grave goods that accompanied the dead to the afterlife, changes that had caused widespread anxiety among Egyptians who feared for their eternal survival. Tutankhamun's government restored traditional mummification practices, reopened the workshops that produced funerary equipment, and re-established the complex rituals that ensured safe passage to the afterlife. The challenge of managing former Atenist officials and believers required careful political maneuvering, as the restoration government needed to avoid the kind of violent persecution that might have destabilized the kingdom. Rather than conducting wholesale purges, Tutankhamun's advisors pursued a policy of gradual integration that allowed former Atenists to retain their positions if they demonstrated genuine conversion to Orthodox beliefs. This pragmatic approach helped maintain administrative continuity while encouraging the peaceful abandonment of Atenist practices. Some former Atenist officials even became enthusiastic supporters of the restoration, perhaps recognizing that their survival depended on demonstrating loyalty to the new religious order. The restoration of traditional festivals and religious celebrations provided opportunities for the young pharaoh to demonstrate his piety while reinforcing popular support for the counter-revolution. The great festivals of Amun at Thebes, which had been suspended during Akhenaten's reign, were restored with unprecedented splendor as the royal government sought to demonstrate divine favor and royal generosity. These celebrations served multiple purposes, providing religious fulfillment for the Egyptian people, economic benefits for local communities, and political legitimacy for the restored monarchy. The young pharaoh's participation in these festivals, carefully choreographed to emphasize his role as intermediary between gods and people, helped establish his credentials as a legitimate ruler in the traditional Egyptian mold. The systematic erasure of Atenist monuments and inscriptions accompanied the positive aspects of religious restoration, as the government sought to eliminate all traces of Akhenaten's religious experiment. Temples built to honor the Aten were dismantled, their stones reused in orthodox construction projects, while inscriptions mentioning the sun disk were chiseled away and replaced with traditional religious formulas. This process of damnatio memoriae was conducted with remarkable thoroughness, reflecting both the government's determination to prevent any Atenist revival and the deep hostility that Akhenaten's revolution had generated among traditional religious authorities. The international dimensions of religious restoration also required attention, as Egypt's relationships with foreign powers had been complicated by Akhenaten's religious innovations. Traditional diplomatic protocols had involved exchanges of religious gifts and participation in each other's festivals, practices that had been disrupted by the Atenist rejection of foreign gods. Tutankhamun's government worked to restore these relationships by demonstrating respect for foreign deities and resuming the religious diplomacy that had helped maintain peace in the ancient Near East. This restoration of religious tolerance marked a sharp contrast with Akhenaten's militant monotheism and helped rebuild Egypt's international prestige. The daily existence of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun unfolded within a world of unimaginable luxury and rigid protocol, where every moment was choreographed to maintain the divine mystique of kingship while providing the education and experiences necessary for his eventual independent rule. The royal palaces of Memphis and Thebes, where the court had relocated after abandoning Amarna, represented the pinnacle of ancient Egyptian civilization. Their walls decorated with exquisite paintings, their gardens filled with exotic plants and animals, and their workshops producing the finest objects in the known world. Within these magnificent settings, the boy king lived a life that balanced the awesome responsibilities of divine rulership with the natural desires and interests of a privileged adolescent. The pharaoh's daily routine began before dawn, with elaborate purification rituals performed by specially trained priests who served the royal household. These ceremonies, which had been restored after the abandonment of Atenist practices, involved the ritual cleansing of the king's body with sacred water, the application of precious oils and perfumes, and the recitation of ancient prayers that ensured divine protection throughout the day. The young pharaoh was then dressed in garments of the finest linen, often decorated with gold thread and precious stones, while servants arranged the various crowns, scepters, and other regalia that symbolized his divine authority. These mourning rituals, though time-consuming, served the crucial function of transforming the mortal boy into the living god who ruled Egypt. The royal wardrobe revealed in Tutankhamun's tomb provides extraordinary insight into the luxury that surrounded the young pharaoh's daily life. Over 100 garments were found in his burial chamber, ranging from simple linen loincloths to elaborate ceremonial robes decorated with intricate beadwork and golden ornaments. Many of these garments show signs of wear, indicating they were actually used during his lifetime, rather than created specifically for burial. The famous golden sandals, leather gloves decorated with hunting scenes, and caps adorned with precious stones demonstrate the extraordinary craftsmanship available to the royal household and the attention paid to even the most mundane aspects of the pharaoh's appearance. Education formed a central component of the young pharaoh's daily schedule as his advisors sought to prepare him for the complex responsibilities of independent rule while ensuring his loyalty to the restored traditional order. Royal tutors, carefully selected from among the most learned scribes and priests in Egypt, instructed the young king in hieroglyphic writing, mathematics, astronomy, and the religious knowledge essential for performing his ceremonial duties. Military training occupied an equally important place in his education, with experienced commanders teaching him the arts of warfare, chariot driving, and archery that were considered essential accomplishments for any pharaoh. The numerous bows, arrows, and other weapons found in his tomb, many showing signs of use, testify to the seriousness with which this military education was pursued. The young pharaoh, his marriage to Tutankhamun added a domestic dimension to palace life that was both personally fulfilling and politically significant. Contemporary art depicts the royal couple in scenes of remarkable intimacy, showing them relaxing together in palace gardens, participating in religious ceremonies, and enjoying each other's company in ways that suggest genuine affection beyond the political necessities of their union. The Queen, who was several years older than her husband and had experienced the upheavals of the Amarna period, may have served as both companion and advisor to the young king. Their shared experiences of loss and restoration created a bond that transcended the typical arranged marriages of Egyptian royalty, though their relationship was undoubtedly shaped by the constant presence of court officials and the demands of royal protocol. Hunting expeditions provided the young pharaoh with opportunities to escape the confines of palace life, while developing skills that were considered essential for royal leadership. The marshlands of the Nile Delta offered excellent hunting for waterfowl, while the desert regions near Memphis provided opportunities to hunt larger game such as gazelles, ostriches, and even lions. These expeditions served multiple purposes beyond recreation, allowing the young king to demonstrate his prowess with traditional weapons, providing fresh meat for palace banquets, and offering occasions for bonding with military commanders and court officials. The elaborate hunting equipment found in Tutankhamun's tomb, including composite bows, throwing sticks, and a magnificent chariot, reflects the importance of these activities in royal life. The palace workshops that served the royal household represented some of the finest centers of craftsmanship in the ancient world, employing master artisans who created objects of unprecedented beauty and technical sophistication. Goldsmiths worked precious metals into intricate jewelry and ceremonial objects, while carpenters crafted furniture inlaid with ivory and ebony imported from distant lands. Textile workers produced garments of extraordinary fineness, often incorporating threads of gold and silver into complex patterns that required months of labor to complete. The young pharaoh would have regularly visited these workshops, observing the creation of objects that would serve both practical and ceremonial purposes in his daily life. Entertainment and leisure activities provided necessary relief from the demanding schedule of royal duties and education. The numerous board games found in Tutankhamun's tomb, including several sets of senet and 20 squares, indicate that the young pharaoh enjoyed these popular Egyptian pastimes. Music and dance formed important components of palace entertainment, with professional musicians and dancers performing at royal banquets and religious ceremonies. The young king may have learned to play musical instruments himself, as several were found in his tomb, including trumpets that were probably used in military and ceremonial contexts. These leisure activities served not only to entertain, but also to provide opportunities for the young pharaoh to interact with courtiers and officials in less formal settings. Religious ceremonies occupied a central place in the young pharaoh's daily routine, as his role as high priest of all Egyptian gods required regular participation in temple rituals and festivals. These ceremonies, which had been restored after the abandonment of Atenist practices, involved complex sequences of offerings, prayers, and ritual actions that maintained the cosmic order and ensured divine favor for Egypt. The young pharaoh's participation in these rituals served both religious and political purposes, demonstrating his piety to the Egyptian people while reinforcing his legitimacy as the god's chosen representative on earth. The elaborate ritual objects found in his tomb, including ceremonial weapons, offering vessels, and priestly regalia, reflect the importance of these religious duties in royal life. Palace banquets provided opportunities for the young pharaoh to exercise his role as host to foreign dignitaries, provincial governors, and court officials while enjoying the finest cuisine available in the ancient world. These elaborate meals featured delicacies from throughout the Egyptian empire, including exotic fruits from Nubia, fine wines from the Delta vineyards, and carefully prepared meats from the royal hunting expeditions. The golden vessels and elaborate serving equipment found in Tutankhamun's tomb provide insight into the luxury that characterized these occasions, while also serving the practical function of demonstrating Egyptian wealth and sophistication to foreign visitors. The constant presence of servants, guards, and officials meant that the young pharaoh rarely experienced true privacy, living instead within a carefully maintained bubble of royal protocol that both protected and isolated him from the realities of ordinary Egyptian life. This isolation was considered necessary to maintain the divine mystique of kingship, but it also meant that the young pharaoh's understanding of his kingdom was largely mediated through the reports and interpretations of his advisors. The challenge facing his regents was to provide him with sufficient knowledge of Egyptian society and politics to rule effectively while maintaining the sacred distance that Egyptian religious tradition demanded between the divine pharaoh and his mortal subjects. The reign of Tutankhamun witnessed one of the most remarkable artistic transformations in Egyptian history as craftsmen and artists navigated the complex challenge of abandoning the revolutionary Amarna style while incorporating its innovations into a restored traditional aesthetic. This artistic counter-revolution was not merely a return to pre-Amarna forms, but rather a sophisticated synthesis that created some of the most beautiful objects in Egyptian art history. The treasures found in Tutankhamun's tomb represent the pinnacle of this artistic renaissance, demonstrating how the trauma and creativity of the Amarna period ultimately enriched rather than destroyed Egyptian artistic tradition. The abandonment of Akhetaten had scattered the royal workshops and displaced the master craftsmen who had created the revolutionary art of the Amarna period. Many of these artisans had fled the experimental capital as Akhenaten's regime collapsed, carrying with them the technical innovations and artistic insights gained during their service to the heretic pharaoh. When Tutankhamun's government re-established royal workshops in Memphis and Thebes, these experienced craftsmen formed the core of a new artistic establishment that combined traditional Egyptian forms with the naturalistic techniques developed during the Atenist experiment. The result was an artistic style that maintained orthodox religious symbolism while displaying unprecedented technical mastery and emotional depth. The famous golden funeral mask of Tutankhamun exemplifies this artistic synthesis, combining the idealized features required by Egyptian royal iconography with subtle naturalistic details that suggest individual personality. The mask's serene expression and perfectly balanced proportions follow traditional conventions for depicting divine kingship, yet the slight asymmetry of the features and the lifelike quality of the modeling reflect the influence of Amarna naturalism. The technical achievement represented by this masterpiece, with its intricate inlay work and flawless gold craftsmanship, demonstrates the extraordinary skill of the artisans working for the restored monarchy and their ability to surpass even the finest works of earlier periods. The restoration of traditional religious art required careful attention to iconographic correctness, as the artists needed to ensure that their works properly honored the restored gods while avoiding any trace of Atenist influence. Scenes depicting the young pharaoh making offerings to Amun-Ra Ptah and other traditional deities replaced the revolutionary imagery of the Amarna period. Yet these compositions often displayed a vitality and emotional engagement that reflected the artistic lessons learned during Akhenaten's reign. The famous scene on the back of Tutankhamun's golden throne, showing the young king and queen in an intimate moment under the rays of the Aten, represents a fascinating transitional work that combines Atenist iconography with traditional craftsmanship, suggesting the gradual nature of the artistic restoration. Sculptured during Tutankhamun's reign achieved new heights of technical perfection, while returning to the idealized forms that had characterized Egyptian royal art for millennia. The numerous statues found in the young pharaoh's tomb display a remarkable range of materials and techniques, from traditional stone carving to innovative work in precious metals and exotic woods. These sculptures demonstrate the artist's mastery of proportion and their ability to convey both divine authority and human personality within the constraints of Egyptian artistic convention. The famous statue of the king, emerging from a lotus flower, symbolizing rebirth and renewal, exemplifies the sophisticated religious symbolism that characterized Restoration art while displaying the technical innovations inherited from the Amarna period. The decorative arts flourished during this period of restoration as royal workshops produced objects of unprecedented luxury and sophistication for the young pharaoh's daily use. The furniture found in Tutankhamun's tomb represents the pinnacle of ancient Egyptian craftsmanship, with chairs, beds, and chests decorated with intricate inlay work, carved reliefs, and precious metal fittings. These objects served both practical and ceremonial purposes, providing the young pharaoh with the luxury appropriate to his divine status while demonstrating Egyptian artistic superiority to foreign visitors and dignitaries. The famous Golden Throne, with its complex iconographic program and flawless execution, exemplifies the marriage of artistic beauty and political symbolism that characterized the finest works of this period. Jewelry and personal ornaments reached new levels of sophistication during Tutankhamun's reign, as goldsmiths and gem cutters created objects that combined traditional Egyptian symbolism with innovative techniques and exotic materials. The numerous pieces found in the young pharaoh's tomb display an extraordinary range of styles and techniques, from simple gold bands to elaborate pectorals incorporating hundreds of individual elements. These objects served not only as personal adornment, but also as powerful symbols of royal authority and divine protection. Their iconographic programs carefully designed to ensure the wearer's safety and success. The famous pectoral depicting the young pharaoh as a sphinx trampling his enemies exemplifies the sophisticated political symbolism embedded in even the most decorative objects. The restoration of the traditional tomb decoration required artists to master the complex iconographic programs that had guided Egyptian funerary art for centuries, while incorporating the technical innovations developed during the Amarna period. The paintings in Tutankhamun's burial chamber represent a fascinating synthesis of traditional religious themes with the naturalistic style that had characterized Amarna art. The famous scene showing the young pharaoh, his mummy being dragged on a sledge by court officials, displays a humanity and emotional engagement rarely seen in earlier royal tomb decoration. Yet the overall program follows orthodox Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife and the pharaoh's divine transformation. Textile production during this period achieved remarkable sophistication, as weavers and embroiderers created garments that combined traditional Egyptian forms with innovative, decorative techniques. The numerous textiles found in Tutankhamun's tomb display an extraordinary range of materials and techniques, from simple linen garments to elaborate robes decorated with gold thread and precious stones. These textiles served both practical and ceremonial purposes, providing the young pharaoh with appropriate clothing for various occasions, while demonstrating the wealth and sophistication of the restored monarchy. The famous beaded dress, with its intricate geometric patterns and flawless execution, exemplifies the technical mastery achieved by Egyptian textile workers during this period. The influence of foreign artistic traditions became more pronounced during Tutankhamun's reign, as the Restoration government sought to rebuild Egypt's international relationships and demonstrate its openness to cultural exchange. Objects found in the young pharaoh's tomb display influences from Nubian, Syrian, and Mesopotamian artistic traditions, suggesting active cultural contact and artistic borrowing. This international dimension of Restoration art reflected Egypt's renewed engagement with the wider ancient world after the isolation of the Amarna period, while also demonstrating the confidence of Egyptian artists in their ability to incorporate foreign elements without compromising their own artistic identity. The workshop organization that produced these artistic masterpieces represented a sophisticated system of craft specialization and artistic collaboration that had been refined over centuries of Egyptian civilization. Master craftsmen supervised teams of specialized workers, each responsible for particular aspects of complex projects that might require months or years to complete. The coordination required to produce objects like Tutankhamun's golden shrine, with its intricate relief decoration and complex assembly, demonstrates the organizational sophistication of Egyptian royal workshops and their ability to manage large-scale artistic projects while maintaining the highest standards of quality and craftsmanship. The artistic legacy of Tutankhamun's reign extended far beyond the objects found in his tomb, influencing Egyptian art for generations and establishing aesthetic standards that would guide royal workshops throughout the remainder of the New Kingdom. The synthesis of traditional forms with Amarna innovations created a new artistic vocabulary that enriched Egyptian art while maintaining its essential character, demonstrating the resilience and adaptability of one of the world's greatest artistic traditions. The restoration of Egypt's international prestige during Tutankhamun's reign required careful diplomatic maneuvering and selective military action to rebuild relationships that had deteriorated during Akhenaten's neglect of foreign affairs. The young pharaoh inherited an empire in crisis, with vassal states in Syria and Palestine either declaring independence or falling under the influence of rival powers, while traditional allies questioned Egypt's commitment to its international obligations. The challenge facing Tutankhamun's advisors was to restore Egyptian credibility abroad, while managing the domestic priorities of religious restoration and political consolidation that demanded immediate attention at home. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence discovered at Akhetaten, reveal the extent of Egypt Tawekker's international difficulties during the final years of Akhenaten's reign and the early period of Tutankhamun's rule. Desperate pleas from Egyptian vassals in the Levant paint a picture of chaos and abandonment, with local rulers begging for military support against encroaching enemies while receiving little or no response from the Egyptian court. The letters from Ribhada of Byblos, Abdihiba of Jerusalem, and other loyal vassals describe attacks by the mysterious Habiru peoples, pressure from expanding Hittite influence, and the gradual collapse of Egyptian authority throughout the region. These communications demonstrate how Akhenaten's obsession with religious reform had allowed Egypt as carefully constructed empire to crumble through neglect. The Hittite Empire posed the most serious threat to Egyptian interests during this period, as the ambitious rulers of Anatolia sought to expand their influence southward into territories that had been Egyptian vassals for generations. Under the leadership of Suppiluliuma I, the Hittites had already established themselves as the dominant power in northern Syria and were actively courting Egyptian vassals with promises of protection and autonomy. The Hittite threat was not merely military, but also diplomatic, as their sophisticated understanding of international law and treaty obligations contrasted sharply with Egypt's recent neglect of its imperial responsibilities. Tutankhamun's government faced the challenge of countering Hittite expansion without provoking a full-scale war that Egypt was not prepared to fight. Nubia, Egypt's traditional source of gold and exotic goods, presented different but equally serious challenges during the early years of Tutankhamun's reign. The disruption of the traditional administrative structures during the Amarna period had weakened Egyptian control over this crucial territory, while local rulers had grown increasingly independent in the absence of effective oversight from the north. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Nubian territories had ceased paying tribute to Egypt during Akhenaten's reign, forcing the restoration government to reassert Egyptian authority through a combination of diplomatic pressure and military demonstration. The young pharaoh's advisors recognized that control of Nubian gold mines was essential for financing both domestic restoration projects and the military campaigns needed to rebuild Egyptian prestige abroad. The restoration of diplomatic relationships with traditional allies required careful attention to the ceremonial and religious aspects of international relations that had been disrupted during the Atenas period. Egyptian diplomacy had traditionally involved the exchange of gifts, participation in religious festivals, and marriages between royal families, practices that had been complicated by Akhenaten's rejection of foreign gods and his isolation in Amarna. Tutankhamun's government worked systematically to restore these relationships, sending diplomatic missions to allied courts, resuming the exchange of luxury goods that had characterized Egyptian foreign relations, and demonstrating respect for foreign religious traditions that had been scorned during the previous reign. Military campaigns during Tutankhamun's reign were limited in scope, but carefully designed to demonstrate Egyptian strength and resolve without overextending the kingdom's resources. Horemheb, serving as the young pharaoh's military deputy, appears to have conducted selective expeditions aimed at reasserting Egyptian authority in key strategic locations, while avoiding the kind of major campaigns that might have provoked dangerous retaliation. Relief carvings from this period show the young pharaoh participating in military activities, though his actual role was probably largely ceremonial given his youth and inexperience. These campaigns served the dual purpose of maintaining military readiness and providing the young pharaoh with opportunities to fulfill his traditional role as Egypt's war leader. The Syrian campaigns of this period focused on re-establishing Egyptian influence in key coastal cities that controlled important trade routes and provided access to valuable resources such as cedar wood and silver. Archaeological evidence suggests that Egyptian forces conducted limited operations in the region, possibly including the siege of rebellious cities and the installation of pro-Egyptian rulers. These campaigns were probably more successful in demonstrating Egyptian resolve than in achieving lasting territorial gains, but they served the important function of signaling to both allies and enemies that Egypt remained a formidable military power, despite the disruptions of the Amarna period. Nubian expeditions during Tutankhamun's reign appear to have been more successful than the Syrian campaigns, possibly because the distances involved made it easier to achieve decisive results without risking major confrontations with rival powers. Inscriptions from this period describe successful campaigns that restored Egyptian control over rebellious territories and resumed the flow of tribute that was essential for financing the restoration government's ambitious projects. The young pharaoh's participation in these campaigns, even if largely symbolic, helped establish his credentials as a successful military leader and demonstrated the restoration of traditional Egyptian values that emphasized pharaonic prowess in warfare. The naval dimension of Egyptian foreign policy during this period remains poorly documented, but evidence suggests that the restoration government worked to rebuild the fleet that had been neglected during Akhenaten's reign. Control of the eastern Mediterranean was essential for maintaining communications with Egyptian territories in the Levant and for protecting the trade routes that brought wealth to Egypt. The restoration of naval power required significant investment in shipbuilding and training, but it was essential for projecting Egyptian influence beyond the Nile Valley and demonstrating the kingdom's continued relevance as a major power in the ancient Near East. Diplomatic marriages continued to play an important role in Egyptian foreign policy during Tutankhamun's reign, though the young pharaoh's marriage to Ankhesenamun limited his availability for such alliances. Instead, the restoration government appears to have used marriages between Egyptian nobles and foreign royalty to cement important relationships while maintaining the fiction that these unions enjoyed royal approval. These marriages served the dual purpose of creating personal bonds between Egyptian and foreign elites, while providing channels for diplomatic communication that could operate independently of formal state-to-state relations. The economic dimensions of foreign relations required careful attention during the restoration period, as Egypt needed to rebuild the trade networks that had been disrupted during the Amarna period, while managing the costs of military campaigns and diplomatic initiatives. The restoration government worked to re-establish commercial relationships with traditional trading partners, resuming the exchange of Egyptian grain and manufactured goods for foreign luxury items and raw materials. These economic relationships were often intertwined with political and military considerations, as trade agreements could serve as instruments of diplomatic pressure while commercial disputes might escalate into military conflicts. Intelligence gathering and diplomatic espionage became increasingly important during this period, as the Restoration government sought to understand the complex political situation in the Near East and identify opportunities for advancing Egyptian interests. The network of Egyptian officials, merchants, and allies throughout the region provided valuable information about the intentions and capabilities of rival powers, while also serving as channels for diplomatic communication and political influence. This intelligence network was essential for the careful calibration of Egyptian foreign policy during a period when the kingdom's resources were limited and its international position remained precarious. The legacy of Tutankhamun's foreign policy was mixed, achieving some success in stabilizing Egypt's international position, while failing to fully restore the empire that had existed during the reign of Amenhotep III. The young pharaoh's advisors had managed to prevent the complete collapse of Egyptian influence abroad, while avoiding the kind of major military disasters that might have further weakened the kingdom. But the fundamental challenges posed by Hittite expansion and the changing balance of power in the ancient Near East remained unresolved at the time of his death. The death of Tutankhamun around 1323 BCE, when he was approximately 19 years old, remains one of ancient Egypt's most enduring mysteries, sparking decades of scientific investigation, forensic analysis, and scholarly debate. The young pharaoh's sudden demise at the height of his physical powers without an obvious heir to continue his dynasty plunged Egypt into another succession crisis and marked the effective end of the royal line that had ruled Egypt since the beginning of the 18th dynasty. The circumstances surrounding his death have been the subject of intense speculation, with theories ranging from accident to assassination, each supported by different interpretations of the physical evidence preserved in his mummified remains. The first systematic examination of Tutankhamun's mummy, conducted by Howard Carter and anatomist Douglas Derry in 1925, revealed several puzzling features that would fuel decades of controversy. The mummy showed evidence of significant damage, including a detached head, missing ribs, and a sternum that had been removed entirely. Initially, these injuries were attributed to rough handling by ancient tomb robbers or careless mummification practices, but subsequent investigations have suggested more sinister possibilities. The absence of the heart, which was traditionally left in place during mummification to serve the deceased in the afterlife, was particularly unusual and raised questions about whether the young pharaoh had died under normal circumstances. X-ray examinations conducted in 1968 by University of Liverpool anatomist Ronald Harrison revealed additional mysteries, including what appeared to be bone fragments loose inside the skull cavity and evidence of a possible blow to the head. These findings led to speculation that Tutankhamun might have been murdered, possibly by a blow from a blunt instrument that caused fatal brain injury. The X-rays also showed that the young pharaoh had suffered a broken leg, though whether this injury occurred before or after death remained unclear. These discoveries transformed scholarly understanding of Tutankhamun's death from a simple case of premature mortality to a potential murder mystery with profound political implications. The most comprehensive investigation of Tutankhamun's death began in 2005 when Egyptian authorities authorized a series of CT scans that provided unprecedented detail about the condition of the mummy and the circumstances of the young pharaoh's demise. These scans, conducted by an international team of radiologists and Egyptologists, revealed that the skull fragments observed in earlier X-rays were likely the result of the mummification process rather than evidence of fatal head trauma. However, the scans confirmed that Tutankhamun had suffered a severe fracture of his left thigh bone, an injury that would have been extremely painful and potentially life-threatening in an era before modern medical treatment. The CT scan evidence suggested that the leg fracture was a fresh injury that had occurred shortly before death, as there was no evidence of healing that would have indicated survival for any significant period after the accident. This discovery led to new theories about the young pharaoh's death, with some scholars proposing that he had been injured in a hunting accident or chariot crash that had become infected, leading to sepsis and death. The numerous hunting weapons and chariots found in his tomb support the theory that he was an active sportsman who regularly engaged in the kind of dangerous activities that might have resulted in such an injury. Recent scientific analysis has also focused on the possibility that Tutankhamun suffered from genetic disorders that might have contributed to his early death. DNA studies conducted on royal mummies have revealed evidence of inbreeding within the royal family, a practice that was common among Egyptian royalty, but which could have resulted in genetic abnormalities that compromised the young pharaoh's health. Some researchers have suggested that Tutankhamun might have suffered from conditions such as temporal lobe, epilepsy, Marfan syndrome, or other genetic disorders that could have made him more susceptible to injury or infection. The political context surrounding Tutankhamun's death adds another layer of complexity to the mystery, as the young pharaoh's demise occurred at a time of significant tension within the Egyptian court. His marriage to Ankhesenamun had apparently failed to produce surviving children, despite evidence from his tomb suggesting that the couple had lost at least 2 daughters in infancy. The absence of a clear heir created a succession crisis that would have been particularly acute given the political instability that had characterized Egypt since Akhenaten's religious revolution. The 2 most powerful figures in the kingdom, A and Horemheb, both had strong motives for ensuring that the succession proceeded according to their interests. The speed with which Tutankhamun was mummified and buried has also raised questions about the circumstances of his death. Analysis of the mummification process suggests that it was conducted hastily, with some traditional procedures abbreviated or omitted entirely. The use of large quantities of resin in the mummification process, which caused significant damage to the mummy's tissues, was unusual and might indicate that the embalmers were working under time pressure. This haste could suggest that the young pharaoh's death was unexpected and that his advisors were eager to complete the burial process quickly to prevent political instability. The condition of Tutankhamun's burial equipment provides additional clues about the circumstances of his death and burial. Many of the objects found in his tomb appear to have been originally made for other members of the royal family, then hastily modified for the young pharaoh's use. The famous golden mask, while perfectly fitted to his mummy, shows evidence of alteration, while some of the canopic jars and other burial equipment bear traces of erased inscriptions that originally belonged to other individuals. This reuse of burial equipment suggests that the young pharaoh's death was unexpected, and that his burial had to be arranged quickly, using whatever materials were available. The location and size of Tutankhamun's tomb in the Valley of the Kings also reflect the hasty nature of his burial arrangements. Unlike the grand sepulchres prepared for other pharaohs, Tutankhamun's tomb was relatively small and appears to have been originally intended for a private individual rather than a king. The tomb's layout, with its cramped chambers and awkward angles, suggests that it was pressed into service as a royal burial site when the young pharaoh's original tomb was not ready for use. This improvised burial arrangement supports the theory that his death was sudden and unexpected. The mysterious circumstances of Tutankhamun's death have been further complicated by the discovery of what appears to be evidence of deliberate damage to his mummy during the mummification process. Some researchers have suggested that the removal of the heart and the extensive use of resin might have been intended to prevent the young pharaoh's successful resurrection in the afterlife. Though this theory remains highly controversial, the possibility that political enemies might have interfered with the mummification process adds another dimension to the mysteries surrounding his death. Modern forensic techniques continue to provide new insights into the circumstances of Tutankhamun's death, though many questions remain unanswered. Virtual autopsy techniques using advanced imaging technology have revealed additional details about his injuries and the condition of his remains. While chemical analysis of the mummification materials has provided clues about the timing and methods used in his preservation, however, the passage of over 3 millennia and the damage caused by both ancient and modern investigations have made it impossible to reach definitive conclusions about exactly how and why the young pharaoh died. The death of Tutankhamun marked not only the end of a brief but significant reign, but also the beginning of a power struggle that would ultimately transform the Egyptian monarchy. His sudden demise without a clear heir created the conditions for the political maneuvering that would bring first I and then Horemheb to the throne, effectively ending the royal line that had ruled Egypt since the expulsion of the Hyksos. The mystery surrounding his death continues to fascinate scholars and the public alike, serving as a reminder of how much about ancient Egypt remains unknown, despite centuries of archaeological investigation and scientific analysis. The death of Tutankhamun did not simply mark the end of a short reign. It unleashed a turbulent struggle over the Egyptian throne, a crisis that revealed the fragility of royal succession in the wake of the Amarna upheaval. With Tutankhamun gone and no direct male heir, the political landscape became a battlefield for influence, ambition, and survival. Central to this power struggle was Ankhesenamun, the young widow of the boy king, who found herself in a position of unprecedented vulnerability. Her desperate attempt to secure her position is famously captured in the letter she sent to the Hittite king, a plea that echoes across the centuries. She requested a Hittite prince to marry, offering him the Egyptian throne and implicitly signaling the absence of a suitable native successor. The letter underscores the desperation of her situation and hints at the fractured nature of Egypt's royal court at the time, where traditional mechanisms of succession had been destabilized by decades of religious and political turbulence. This appeal, unusual in its boldness, illuminates how precarious the transition of power could be, especially in a court still recovering from the radical reforms of Akhenaten and the brief restoration efforts of Tutankhamun. Meanwhile, within Egypt, influential courtiers and military officials were maneuvering to secure their own positions in the emerging hierarchy. I, an experienced advisor and former vizier under Akhenaten, recognized the vacuum left by Tutankhamun's death and acted swiftly. By marrying Ankhesenamun, I effectively legitimized his claim to the throne and inserted himself into the royal lineage, consolidating authority in a period when claims could be challenged violently and without precedent. This marriage was not merely a personal union. It was a calculated political move designed to stabilize governance and prevent civil unrest, while simultaneously sidelining potential rivals from the Amarna line. The rapidity with which I assumed power reflects both his political acumen and the urgency created by Tutankhamun. A sudden demise, a continuation of the same conditions that had led to the hasty burial of the young king. The elimination of the Amarna royal line was a critical aspect of this succession struggle. With Tutankhamun's passing, the remaining heirs were either too young, politically inconvenient, or had been compromised by their association with Akhenaten's controversial religious reforms. I's accession, while consolidating authority, also signaled the deliberate closure of the Amarna period, as he and his successors sought to restore traditional religious practices and secure the loyalty of the priesthood of Amun. Yet even I's reign was transitional. His position was ultimately a bridge between the fragile recovery of order after Tutankhamun and the emergence of a more militarized, stabilized rule under Horemheb. Horemheb, a seasoned general, would eventually assert control not through dynastic claim, but through military strength, eliminating remaining Amarna sympathizers and reorganizing the state's administration to prevent future succession crises. This transition illustrates the volatility of Egypt's political system in the late 18th dynasty, where dynastic continuity could be upended by sudden death, factionalism, and the strategic interventions of ambitious courtiers. Ankhesenamun's plight also highlights the gendered dimensions of power in ancient Egypt. As a queen, she could wield influence only indirectly, through marriage, negotiation, or alignment with powerful male figures. Yet her actions were pivotal in shaping the outcome of the succession struggle. Her letter to the Hittite king is a rare historical testament to a woman exercising agency in an era dominated by male rulers, revealing both her political savvy and the extreme pressures imposed upon her. The international dimension of her appeal also emphasizes how succession crises in Egypt were not solely domestic matters. They had diplomatic and even military implications, as foreign powers could be courted or threatened in order to legitimize or challenge claims to the throne. The convergence of domestic intrigue and foreign diplomacy during this period underscores the broader geopolitical stakes surrounding the young king's death. Ultimately, the struggle for succession after Tutankhamun's death set the stage for a fundamental transformation of Egyptian governance. A's short-lived rule restored continuity to the throne, but it was Horemheb's eventual rise that cemented the transition from the fragile dynastic structures of the Amarna period to a more centralized, militarized, and bureaucratically controlled state. The political turbulence of this era, from Ankhesenamun's desperate outreach to the calculated maneuvering of Ai and the eventual consolidation by Horemheb, illustrates how fragile and contested kingship could be in ancient Egypt. Tutankhamun's untimely death and the ensuing struggle to determine who would wield royal authority left an indelible mark on the 18th dynasty, shaping both the fate of the Amarna lineage and the administrative reforms that would characterize subsequent rulers. The power dynamics of this period, a mixture of desperation, ambition, and calculated strategy, reveal a court striving to reconcile ritual, dynastic legitimacy, and political pragmatism under extraordinary pressure, all while the memory of a boy king hovered as both a symbol of continuity and a reminder of vulnerability. After Tutankhamun's death and the turbulent succession that followed, a deliberate campaign emerged to erase his memory and obscure the entire Amarna period from official records. Unlike many pharaohs whose monuments and inscriptions celebrated their reigns in perpetuity, Tutankhamun's name was systematically removed from king lists, his statues defaced, and his inscriptions obliterated or repurposed by later rulers. Temples he had restored or commissioned were stripped of their royal markers, and even the lavish funerary items in his tomb, while untouched for millennia, reveal signs of hurried adaptation, perhaps a symbolic reflection of the court's desire to minimize his historical footprint. This obliteration was not simply an act of neglect. It was a conscious effort to distance Egypt from a period considered politically and religiously destabilizing. The Amarna interlude initiated by Akhenaten, whose monotheistic devotion to the sun, god Aten, had alienated powerful priesthoods and regional officials. By erasing Tutankhamun and the Amarna line, successors sought to restore the traditional religious order, re-establish the authority of the Amun priesthood, and legitimize their own claims to continuity, presenting themselves as restorers rather than innovators in the eyes of the populace. The process of erasure extended beyond textual records. Monuments, statues, and inscriptions associated with Tutankhamun were either destroyed or re-inscribed with the names of later rulers, a common practice known as usurpation, which served both practical and symbolic purposes. Through this, the Amarna period and its young king were effectively removed from collective memory, their legacy buried under layers of political expediency. Even architectural projects he had initiated were completed or modified by subsequent pharaohs, leaving little trace of his personal imprint. This systematic obliteration demonstrates the lengths to which the ruling elite went to control historical narrative, emphasizing that memory in ancient Egypt was not merely cultural, but a tool of power. To erase a king was to assert dominance over the past and shape the ideological present. Paradoxically, the very campaign designed to erase Tutankhamun's existence contributed to the preservation of his tomb. By obscuring his name and minimizing attention to his burial site, the tomb in the Valley of the Kings avoided the fate of many other royal sepulchres that were plundered over centuries by tomb robbers. While other pharaohs' treasures were looted, Tutankhamun's resting place remained hidden beneath layers of rock and rubble, inadvertently shielding it from the destructive forces that targeted more prominent, well-known rulers. The irony is striking. The attempt to render him invisible in history preserved the most intact royal tomb ever discovered, a cache of artifacts and art unrivaled in both richness and historical significance. This obscurity transformed Tutankhamun from a forgotten king into a timeless symbol, whose rediscovery would centuries later redefine public imagination and scholarly understanding of ancient Egypt. The erasure of Tutankhamun also illuminates the broader cultural and religious motivations behind the selective rewriting of history. The Amarna period was an anomaly, characterized by radical theological reforms that threatened entrenched priestly powers and disrupted centuries of ritual continuity. To preserve societal stability, it was essential for succeeding rulers to legitimize themselves as restorers of the old gods and purveyors of a stable monarchy. By removing Tutankhamun from official memory, they could sever his connection to a controversial legacy and diminish the influence of any factions loyal to the Amarna ideology. His obliteration was thus both a political necessity and a cultural recalibration, ensuring that future generations would view the restoration of a tradition as a triumph rather than a compromise. Interestingly, the campaign against Tutankhamun was not entirely uniform, leaving subtle traces of his reign that would later intrigue archaeologists. Fragments of inscriptions, altered statues, and residual artifacts hinted at the presence of a ruler whose story had been deliberately muted. These surviving pieces, though scattered and incomplete, provided tantalizing clues that hinted at the boy king's existence and the extraordinary stealth of his funerary cache. The deliberate attempts to erase him paradoxically created a puzzle for future generations, a mystery that would ignite imaginations and fuel a century-long quest to uncover the forgotten pharaoh's life, death, and burial. In this sense, the act of forgetting became a historical safeguard, preserving the very secrets that would later astonish the world. Through the systematic obliteration of Tutankhamun's memory, the Amarna period became a shadow in Egyptian history, obscured by the narratives of later rulers who sought to cement their legitimacy. Yet this deliberate obscurity laid the foundation for one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. By removing him from public consciousness and removing his monuments from prominent locations, the ancient Egyptians inadvertently protected the integrity of his burial, allowing modern scholars to witness an unparalleled glimpse into royal life, funerary ritual, and material culture. The erasure of Tutankhamun thus stands as both a testament to the power of political memory and a reminder that history's silences can sometimes preserve more than its loudest declarations. The rediscovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 by British archaeologist Howard Carter marked one of the most sensational moments in the history of archaeology, transforming both scholarly understanding and popular imagination of ancient Egypt. After years of painstaking excavation in the Valley of the Kings, Carter finally uncovered the sealed entrance to a tomb that had remained largely untouched for over 3 millennia. The meticulous process that followed was as extraordinary as the discovery itself. Carter and his team moved with painstaking care, fully aware of the historical and cultural significance of each artifact. Every object was catalogued, photographed, and preserved, a process that often took months for even a single chamber. The methodical documentation contrasted sharply with the tomb's contents, which exuded opulence, artistic mastery, and religious symbolism on a scale unparalleled in Egyptology. As the inner chambers were opened, the world was introduced to a treasure trove of gilded statues, intricately decorated chests, ceremonial chariots, and furniture that testified to the grandeur of a young king's court. The famous gold mask of Tutankhamun, with its lifelike features and radiant craftsmanship, quickly became an icon of ancient Egyptian art and a symbol of the boy king himself. The tomb's contents provided unprecedented insight into the funerary practices and beliefs of the 18th dynasty. Each chamber, densely packed with ritual objects, reflected the Egyptians' obsession with the afterlife and the elaborate preparations required to ensure a pharaoh's safe passage. From the ceremonial weapons to the vessels containing food, drink, and oils, every item had a purpose, offering protection, sustenance, or spiritual guidance in the journey beyond death. The extraordinary condition of these artifacts allowed scholars to study the techniques, materials, and aesthetic sensibilities of the time in remarkable detail. The juxtaposition of opulent treasures with utilitarian items also illustrated the dual focus of Egyptian funerary culture: reverence for the king's divine role and attention to practical, ritualistic necessities. Carter's discovery thus transformed Egyptology, providing an unparalleled window into royal life, craftsmanship, and religious ideology that had previously been known only through fragmented inscriptions or the remains of looted tombs. The global impact of Tutankhamun's discovery was immediate and profound. Newspapers around the world carried sensational headlines, captivating the public with tales of gold, curses, and the boy king's mysterious life. Exhibitions of the treasures toured internationally, drawing millions of visitors and cementing Tutankhamun's place in popular culture. Beyond spectacle, the find sparked intense scholarly debate regarding burial practices, dynastic politics, and the social dynamics of the 18th dynasty. Each artifact became a subject of rigorous study, revealing details about metallurgy, woodworking, textile production, and artistic conventions in ancient Egypt. The careful preservation and documentation conducted by Carter and his team ensured that this knowledge could be shared globally, creating a lasting legacy of research and education. The tomb also shed light on the hurried and unusual aspects of Tutankhamun's burial, offering physical evidence for historical hypotheses about his sudden death and the political turmoil that followed. The small size of the tomb, the repurposed funerary objects, and the positioning of the body aligned with prior conjectures about the haste of his interment. Yet it was the sheer completeness and preservation of the site that astonished archaeologists. Unlike many pharaonic tombs, which had been looted or damaged over centuries, Tutankhamun's resting place remained a pristine record of royal burial. The survival of perishable items, such as painted wood, textiles, and papyrus, allowed researchers to explore aspects of material culture and daily life that would otherwise have been lost, revealing the sophistication and ritual intricacy of the Egyptian court. Moreover, the discovery illuminated broader questions about Egyptian art, religion, and kingship. The abundance of symbolic motifs, from depictions of protective deities to representations of celestial cycles, highlighted the complex interplay between religion and governance. Tutankhamun's tomb also offered insight into the economic and social structures of the time, suggesting the coordination of skilled artisans, religious specialists, and administrative officials to create a burial fit for a divine monarch. Each object, whether functional, decorative, or ceremonial, contributed to a holistic understanding of the spiritual and political priorities of Tutankhamun's reign. The find demonstrated that even a brief reign could produce monumental cultural output, and that material culture could survive centuries of neglect or deliberate erasure. Howard Carter's discovery, while a product of diligent scholarship, also inspired popular fascination with the enigmatic figure of Tutankhamun himself. The Boy King's tomb became a bridge between ancient history and contemporary imagination, linking the meticulous work of archaeology with the human desire to uncover stories, mysteries, and symbols from the distant past. The artifacts, often lavish beyond measure, captured the contrast between Tutankhamun's brief, politically precarious reign and the eternal grandeur with which he was commemorated in death. The global attention, coupled with ongoing research, ensured that Tutankhamun was no longer a forgotten figure erased by history, but a central icon of ancient Egypt, whose story continues to resonate through scholarly inquiry, museum exhibitions, and popular media. In essence, the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb was both a triumph of archaeological precision and a cultural phenomenon, revealing the intricacies of royal burial, the sophistication of Egyptian craftsmanship, and the enduring allure of a young king whose life was cut tragically short. The painstaking excavation, careful preservation, and subsequent study of his treasures established benchmarks for archaeological methodology, while simultaneously captivating the world, bridging the gap between historical scholarship and mass fascination. The artifacts within the tomb, each imbued with ritual significance and artistic mastery, transformed Tutankhamun from a nearly forgotten ruler into an enduring symbol of ancient Egyptian civilization, elevating a brief and turbulent reign into a narrative of wonder, mystery, and discovery that continues to inspire generations. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb not only revolutionized archaeology, but also transformed global understanding of ancient Egypt, establishing the Boy King as a cultural and historical icon whose influence extends far beyond his brief reign. Prior to 1922, much of the 18th dynasty was understood only through fragmented records, looted tombs, and inscriptions that provided limited insight into royal life. Tutankhamun's intact burial, however, offered an unprecedented window into the material, spiritual, and ceremonial world of the pharaohs. Scientific analysis of his mummy, aided by modern technologies such as CT scans, DNA sequencing, and chemical studies, has revealed details about his health, lineage, and even the cause of his untimely death. These studies have uncovered evidence of congenital conditions, injuries, and medical interventions, providing a more nuanced understanding of the challenges faced by the young ruler and offering a tangible connection to the human realities behind royal iconography. The artifacts themselves, from gilded thrones to ceremonial chariots, have illuminated the artistic, religious, and administrative sophistication of ancient Egypt, allowing researchers to reconstruct rituals, fashion, and daily life with unparalleled fidelity. Beyond academic circles, Tutankhamun's legacy permeated popular culture, inspiring exhibitions, documentaries, literature, and artistic works that have captivated millions worldwide. The Boy King's iconic funerary mask and the lavish treasures of his tomb became symbols of the allure of ancient civilizations, feeding the imagination of generations eager to explore mysteries of the past. The concept of a cursed tomb, sensationalized by contemporary media, further heightened public fascination, blending myth, history, and intrigue in ways that have perpetuated his story across decades. Tutankhamun became emblematic not only of the opulence of the Egyptian monarchy, but also of the fragility of human life and the enduring power of cultural memory. His story bridges the gap between archaeological discovery and storytelling, transforming a once-forgotten ruler into a figure whose life and death continue to inspire fascination, research, and artistic interpretation. Current research continues to expand the understanding of Tutankhamun's era. Scholars examine the tomb's artifacts to study ancient craftsmanship, trade networks, and resource distribution, revealing connections between Egypt and distant regions of the ancient world. Conservation techniques and non-invasive imaging technologies are applied to preserve the delicate materials, ensuring that future generations can continue to study the tomb in its near-original condition. The mummy itself, is a focal point for ongoing debates regarding mummification practices, the impact of genetic disorders, and the health challenges of royal lineages. Researchers also investigate the political and religious climate of the period, connecting Tutankhamun's hasty burial, the eradication of the Amarna legacy, and the rise of military rule under Horemheb into a cohesive narrative that contextualizes his reign within broader Egyptian history. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Tutankhamun's legacy is the paradox of his historical impact. Despite ruling for less than a decade and being nearly erased from history, he became the most famous Egyptian pharaoh in modern times. His obscurity, engineered by political successors, ironically preserved his tomb and enabled one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The treasures he left behind, frozen in time, continue to inform scholars and enthrall the public, ensuring that his brief life resonates far beyond the temporal constraints of his own era. In museums, academic publications, and popular media, Tutankhamun serves as a symbol of human curiosity, the allure of the unknown, and the enduring fascination with life, death, and the afterlife in ancient Egypt. Even today, unanswered questions fuel the mystique surrounding Tutankhamun. The exact circumstances of his death remain debated, with theories ranging from accident to assassination. The hurried nature of his burial raises questions about the internal dynamics of the royal court and the broader implications of political instability during the 18th dynasty. Scholars continue to study the tomb's artifacts, exploring symbolic meanings, manufacturing techniques, and ritual purposes, deepening understanding of Egyptian cosmology and royal ideology. Each new discovery adds layers to the narrative, bridging millennia to connect modern observers with a young pharaoh whose life, though fleeting, left an indelible mark on history. Ultimately, Tutankhamun's eternal legacy is a testament to the interplay between human ambition, cultural memory, and historical chance. His rediscovery reshaped Egyptology, transforming assumptions about ancient society, religion, and art. The treasures of his tomb remain a source of inspiration and knowledge, while his life story exemplifies both the vulnerability and the enduring power of kingship. In captivating the imagination of the world, Tutankhamun transcends the limitations of his short reign, embodying the timeless allure of ancient Egypt and the profound connections between past and present, mortality and eternity, obscurity and immortality.